Good morning. Welcome to church. It's lovely to have you here. I'm Dave. I'm on the leadership team here, and it's always a real joy to get the chance to stand up in front of folks and kind of open God's Word and have a look at the Bible and see what we can learn, what we can be taught, and really to meet the character of Jesus, the person of Jesus, through the Bible. So, for those of you who have been here more often than not this year, you will know that we are cannonballing through the whole of the Bible. Is the verb I decided to use, traveling at pace. Although maybe it's more like a snowball rolling down the hill, because that's what we're going for. We're trying to present the whole narrative, the whole story, the whole flow of what goes on in the Bible, and like a snowball rolling down a hill, picking up material, picking up stuff, picking up knowledge, picking up these images as we go, so that it combines into something kind of huge and big, and that really enhances our understanding. We've picked up this phrase that the Bible is a unified story that points to Jesus. And at some points when we were talking about the Old Testament, that was maybe harder to focus on. We were a long way away from Jesus and some of that. As we've got closer, as we've progressed, the kind of lines have come into focus, if you like. And now we're in the New Testament. We are meeting people and characters that interacted directly with Jesus. And we're calling this chunk of what we're doing kind of encounters with Jesus, talking about people who met Jesus face to face, who interacted with him, who encountered with him, who kind of engaged him. So Esther did a fantastic job last week, for those of you who were here, talking about Jesus' friend John. And Jesus' friend John refers to himself in the book he wrote as the disciple that Jesus loved. And Esther did a great job at kind of either ends of that gospel, of that story of Jesus. So for those of you that may be less familiar with the Bible is a collection of literature, a collection of different types of writing. There are 4 stories of Jesus' lives presented, written by 4 dudes who were either eyewitnesses themselves or talked to the eyewitnesses of Jesus' life. And they put together these four collected stories of who Jesus was and what he did. And there are 3, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, that are quite similar. They have lots of the same stories. They're called the synoptics, if we're looking for posh theological word points. The synoptic gospels, those 3, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and they're broadly similar. And then there's really the odd one out, John at the end. And because I'm me and I'm weird, and I like rhubarb and custard sweets, John's gospel is probably my favorite, because I like an odd one out. I'm always kind of into the outsider. And there's a few things I really love about John's story. So Esther did a really good job of kind of framing what John was trying to do. 1, he consistently refers to himself as the disciple Jesus loved, and that theme of love is one thing that we'll come back to a lot. 2, he's really clear about what John is trying to do when he wrote his book. He's trying to show you who Jesus was and what Jesus came to do. And then 3, he's kind of even more right at the end in the outro that Esther talked about. He writes, I write these things so that you may believe who Jesus is, that he's the Christ, and that by believing you might have life in his name. So when the author of the book tells you what he's trying to do, that's great. He's upfront about that. But actually, Esther was she had 40 minutes to talk, and as she said, just reading John by itself is probably an hour and a half of activity, and I'd recommend, read it. Those kind of modern, episodic, your Lines of Duty, your Sherlock, your Game of Thrones, whatever, this matches up. This is great storytelling. It's fantastic. And John, in the way that this book is structured, uses 3 things. He uses the structure. So this structure you see laid out. John 1 is an intro. Chapters 2 to 11 are this bit called the Book of Signs, where Jesus shows who he is. And then there's this thing called the Book of Glory, where Jesus kind of completes his mission. He accomplishes what he's there to do. and then there's this outro at the end in John 21. So it's beautifully structured. And then he uses story and themes to really reinforce that point. So that's what we're going to do today. Esther did a great job of laying out that structure, like as two bits of bread, and I'm going to try and give you the jam in the sandwich, although being me, it's like bacon, lettuce, tomato, maybe some cheese as well, cucumber, bit of pickle, mayo if you're feeling fancy, but like there's a lot of stuff in there, is what I'm trying to tell you. And like John uses these patterns, these repeated patterns, and he loves a seven. There are sevens all over the book for a variety of different reasons, which, again, there's a PhD thesis in writing, so we won't get too far into them. But he talks about 7 signs. There are 7 miracles in John, which he uses as signs to point who Jesus is. And we've talked about a couple of them. So he cures a man who is blind. Right starts way in the wedding in Cana when he turns water into wine. And the general picture through these 7 signs is they go from kind of small to big. Is the thought. So it starts with the wedding in Cana and turning water into wine, kind of a party trick, if you like. That's blasphemous, so I shan't say it. But all the way up to the story we're going to look at today, where he raises Lazarus to life. There are 7 names of Jesus, which John uses to show us Jesus as the completion of these kind of Old Testament images. So across all of John, people refer to Jesus in different ways, and they are the completion of the Old Testament images. And that's why this snowball rolling down a hill. We've kind of come quite quickly through the Old Testament, but we've picked up images along the way. We know what a king means. We know what a prophet means. We've begun to learn what the fulfillment of Messiah from Genesis 1, 2, and 3 looks like. Like these are things we're carrying in our heads because they pop out of the text as we read them. And then these 7 I am statements where Jesus nails his colors to the mast. One of the features of the other 3 Gospels, the Synoptics, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, is that Jesus is creatively indistinct, to use a phrase, creatively indistinct about who he is. It's not true in John. In John, Jesus presents himself, and he nails his colors to the mast by using these words, I am, which is the word that God uses for himself when he introduces himself to his people Israel in the Old Testament. So God refers to himself as the I am, the one entity in the universe that is able to self-define. That's complicated philosophy. Let's push that to one side, but that's what Jesus is tying himself to with these 7 I am statements. And Lazarus, I've called it the Lazarus encounter, which I think sounds like a cool 1970s TV show, but that's a separate thing. Where we're sitting, the material we're going to look at right now is in John 11, which is the kind of midpoint of the gospel. It's the transition between Jesus showing us who he is and then into what he came to do, and it sits as the midpoint, the kind of pivot point, if you like, of the gospel. So we're at a really kind of critical and exciting point in the story. Let's dive straight in. So if you'll turn with me, if you've got a Bible, open it up, because I think reading the text and hearing the text at the same time is an ideal thing. And if you can open it up to John 11, let's push ahead. So from John 11, verse 1, and I'll read it in 3 chunks and then reflect on those chunks. Now, a man named Lazarus was sick. He was from Bethany, the village of Mary and her sister Martha. This Mary, whose brother Lazarus now lay sick, was the same one who poured perfume on the Lord and wiped his feet with her hair. So the sisters sent word to Jesus, Lord, the one that you love is sick. When he heard this, Jesus said, this sickness will not end in death. No, it's for God's glory, so that God's Son may be glorified through it. Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus. Yet when he heard that Lazarus was sick, he stayed where he was for 2 more days. Then he said to his disciples, let's go back to Judea. So, a little bit of context. The chapter before, the last episode, Jesus had left Jerusalem because he'd got into trouble with the rulers there. He was a threat to them, and they have told him, coming back will put you in danger. If you come back to Jerusalem, we will kill you. So Jesus has gone away and done some preaching back up north, and he hears that his friend who lives in Bethany, that map is very small. That was meant to be more informative than that is. But his friend who lives 2 miles from Jerusalem, so really close to Jerusalem, in Bethany, which is now called El Elazir, which means Lazarus' town, which I quite like, but we'll get back to that. Bethany, which is 2 miles from Jerusalem, he knows that to come back this close to Jerusalem is going to be a problem for him. It's going to be a threat. And because of the way that we've dealt these sermons out, this is not Jesus' first encounter with Lazarus, Mary, and Martha. These are established characters in the story. We know who they are. Elaine, who's here next week, will give us a big talk about Mary and Martha in particular, so I'm not going to do any spoilers for what she's got to talk about, but these are people we know. They've been introduced to us in the story before, and we understand kind of who they are. And then I want you to notice, just in those first 8 verses, how many times the word love is used. Singing that song that Tim and I didn't chat about, but how marvelous, how wonderful is my Saviour's love for me. One of the things that draws together all of the characters who we will meet in this story is that they understand that. They understand that Jesus is the embodiment of the loving kindness of God. So we talked when we were in the Old Testament 12 weeks ago about this word chesed. I've been working on my pronunciation. Chesed. Which is this word, loving kindness. It's this word which describes the love that God has for his people. And the thing that, if you take away nothing else from me talking today, a thing I want you to take away, to focus on, that Esther was talking about last week, that I'm sure Elaine will talk about next week, is that people who spent time with Jesus in the gospel went away assured that he loved them. It's what John calls himself when he writes into the biography of his friend. He is the disciple that Jesus loved. It's what Mary and Martha, when calling for Jesus because their brother is sick, they say, "You love our brother." And then John confirms it again in the text. Despite loving them, he waited to go. Jesus' love and their assuredness of his love is the golden strand that runs through all of these encounters. And that is what, okay, I'll go with this image. It's popped into my head. Anyway, I don't know if you've ever watched a horror movie where the kind of big bad relentlessly pursues the victims despite whatever they do. It's a bad image, but that's what the chesed of God is. It is love that pursues you despite you trying to escape it. That is the space that we're operating in here, and it's the one thing that really just runs through the whole of the Gospel of John. So, yeah, that's... Let's jump back into the passage before I say any more nonsense. So jumping on to verse 17. So Jesus has gone away from Jerusalem. He needs to come back because his friend is sick, and he waits, but then he decides to come back. On his arrival, Jesus found that Lazarus had already been in the tomb for 4 days. Bethany was less than 2 miles from Jerusalem, and many Jews had come to Mary and Martha to comfort them in the loss of their brother. When Martha heard that Jesus was coming, she went out to meet him, but Mary stayed at home. "Lord," Martha said to Jesus, "if you had been here, my brother would not have died. But I know that even now God will give you whatever you ask." Jesus said to her, "Your brother will rise again." Martha answered, "I know that he will rise again in the resurrection at the last day." Jesus said to her, "I am the resurrection and the life. He who believes in me will live even though he dies, and whoever lives and believes in me will never die. Do you believe this?" "Yes, Lord," she told him, "I believe that you are the Christ and the Son of God who's come into the world." And after she said this, she went back and called her sister Mary aside. "The teacher is here," she said, "and is asking for you." When Mary heard this, she got up quickly and went to him. Now Jesus had not yet entered the village, but was still at the place where Martha had met him. When the Jews who had been with Mary in the house, comforting her, noticed how quickly she got up and went out, they followed her, supposing she was going to the tomb to mourn there. When Mary reached the place where Jesus was and saw him, she fell at his feet and said, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died." When Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who'd come along with her also weeping, he was deeply moved in spirit and troubled. "Where have you laid him?" he asked. "Come and see, Lord," they replied. Jesus wept. Then the Jews said, "See how he loved him." But some of them said, "Could not he who opened the eyes of the blind man have kept this man from dying?" So another little pause there. Whew, there's so much to unpack there. There's so much stuff in there. So what do we see? I don't know if you noticed. Mary and Martha approach Jesus with the same question. Two sisters, same circumstance, same question, same challenge, very different responses. "Lord, if you'd been here, my brother would not have died." And with Martha, Jesus gets into what seems to be a theological debate, kind of. Martha gives what is a very orthodox, like if you do a bit of side reading, you'll discover that Martha answered, "I know that he will rise again on the resurrection at the last day." That's 100% tight theological doctrine for a first century Jew of the time. That's the right Sunday school answer. That's the correct one. And what does Jesus respond? "I am," it's one of those seven, "I am the resurrection and the life." You'll note there a couple of things. One, Jesus doesn't say, "I have the power to raise your brother from the dead." He says, "I am the resurrection and the life." You'll note like there's a real difference here between who we think, like the space that Jesus leaves you for understanding who he is. This encounter is about Jesus explaining who he is. And then we get to Mary. And when Mary comes out and says, "Lord, if you'd been here, my brother would not have died," the response is really different. Jesus weeps with them. He enters into emotion with her. This word, "he was deeply moved in spirit and troubled," is a kind of slightly interesting English translation. The Greek word means kind of bellowing with rage. It means snorting with anger. It brings to mind like a bull going like that. That's the image there. Jesus is sad and angry. And it's worth maybe digging into why he's sad and angry there. Like, is he angry at the family? Like, is he... Earlier in the gospel, he's got into a discussion about the blind man, where the Pharisees ask him, "God, is it because this man is sinful, or because his parents were sinful that he's blind?" And Jesus said, "No, it's not. Like, neither. He's blind so that God's power can be shown here." And what Jesus is saying about suffering here is not that Lazarus has died because he specifically is sinful, because something has gone wrong in him. So that's not why he's angry. He's not angry with the family or Mary or Martha or Lazarus for being sinful and therefore dying. He's just claimed to be God, and he's not angry at himself. So what is he angry at? He's angry at the fact of death, the fact that he knows that the world that he created, that he's just claimed to have created, was not meant to be like this. And his "I am the resurrection and the life" is kind of played out in that. I think one of the things I really take away from this is kind of the character of Jesus. I think there's one commentator who says, if you were a fiction author, if you were writing fiction, you would never write Jesus like this. Like, if Jesus was a Marvel superhero, like, about to raise somebody from the dead, what character would you give him? Well, you could kind of go the Iron Man, Tony Stark route, the kind of like glib show off, haha, Mary, watch this. Or you could kind of go for the mighty, like the person that says, I am the resurrection and the life, and then Lazarus is immediately raised to life. But actually, because this is an eyewitness account, and because it happened, John is telling us with his narrative what he's been telling us in kind of declaration all along. He is telling us that Jesus is both God, the divine I am, and also human. And it's not like some mixed potion. It's not like a kind of shaken up. He is fully divine and fully human. This picture here, this very famous icon, it's in Hagia Sophia in Turkey, in Istanbul. And I just thought they were bad at drawing when they made it, but it's called Christ Pantocrator, and it's a deliberate choice. Like, if you look at it and you see the kind of asymmetry in Jesus' face, it's not just because they were bad at drawing, although they may also have been bad at drawing. It's because they're the person, the kind of ancient Christian that made the icon, is trying to capture the same thing that John is trying to capture in the way he's constructed this story here. That Christ's divine, like in Jesus, the divine nature of God and the personal nature of his humanity come together. And that's what the two sides of the face in that icon are. That is an interesting fact for me. But John is trying to capture the same thing in his narrative, like who Jesus is what we're seeing there. So if we canter on to verse 38, just kind of keeping an eye on time, we see Jesus kind of once more deeply moved came to the tomb. It was a cave with a stone laid across the entrance. "Take away the stone," he said. "But Lord," said Martha, the sister of the dead man, "by this time there's a bad odor, for he's been in there 4 days." Then Jesus said, "Did I not tell you that if you believed, you would see the glory of God?" So they took away the stone. Then Jesus looked up and said, "Father, I thank you that you have heard me. I know that you always hear me, but I said this for the benefit of the people standing here, that they may believe that you sent me." When he had said this, Jesus called in a loud voice, "Lazarus, come out." The dead man came out, his hands and feet wrapped with the strips of linen and a cloth around his face. Jesus said to them, "Take off the grave clothes and let him go." Therefore, many of the Jews who had come to visit Mary and seen what Jesus did put their faith in him. Woofka. It's a story. It really is. Like, points to note. 4 days after the death. So Jesus didn't get there till 4 days after the death. We might not care. It's an important point at the time. The Jews of the time, like, medical science is not terribly advanced, and it's quite hard to work out when people have died. Like, that's the long and the short of it. And therefore, there was a kind of theory that when you died, your spirit kind of hovered around your body. Like, I don't know if you know the origin of the word wake. Like, the word wake in, like, particularly Irish culture, but the word wake is the same thing. It's giving again, medical science not being what it is, giving somebody's apparent corpse a chance to demonstrate that it's a corpse and not wake back up again. And it's the same thing in the first century. They believed the spirit kind of hovered around for up to 3 days and people could come back to life. So by 4 days, and actually, Martha said in this translation, by this time there is a bad odor, for he's been there 4 days. My preference here is the King James Version, which said, "Lord, by this time he stinketh," which is why it's the title of this slide. I enjoy that immensely. So the point here is Lazarus is proper dead, and it's a chance for Jesus to demonstrate who he is. So here's the encounter. What does raising Lazarus from the dead do? It does three things. It backs up the I am statement. Somebody who says, I am God, and then doesn't do the kind of things that Jesus does is talking, they might be talking metaphysically, they might be talking philosophically, they might be talking, so there should be a third thing there, but that's maybe not, about being the resurrection and the life. It's a claim. The demonstration of that claim is raising Lazarus from the dead. 2, it convinces the eyewitnesses, the people around, kind of who Jesus is. Many of the Jews who'd come to visit Mary and seen what Jesus did, put their faith in him. When you raise people from the dead. But then the final thing it does, and this is further on in the passage, is it signs Jesus' death warrant. So not only does coming close to Jerusalem, kind of the Pharisees have warned him, coming close to Jerusalem and raising dead people and doing the greatest of his signs kind of puts him on notice from the Pharisees. The religious leaders of the time are wholly threatened by somebody who claims to be God and then goes around acting like it. So that's the story. Quite quickly, what have we got? What have we got in kind of takeaways here? When I was a student, we spent time doing kind of Christian mission things. One of those things was pitching a tent in the middle of a big field in Edinburgh called the Meadows, and like running tent stuff from it, doing kind of mission things. And I was a fairly cocky student, because I'm a fairly cocky human and continue to be. And I really enjoyed like being in the tent and just having randoms come and talk to them about Jesus. And I was pretty cocky about this traditional thing that we use as Christians. We talk about the conclusions that Jesus leaves you with, this kind of mad, bad, or God. C.S. Lewis made it famous. It was kind of used before that. He calls it the trilemma, the three conclusions you're left with about the person of Jesus. That a person who said the kind of things that Jesus did and did the kind of things that Jesus did leaves you with one of three conclusions. One, you can believe he's mad, and I have, I'll get to that story. You can think he's bad, you can think he's poorly intentioned and evil, or you can come to the conclusion that he's telling the truth, that he presents himself as the Son of God, that the things he does are the Son of God. One of the things that C.S. Lewis is trying to do there is people look at the life of Jesus, people look at Jesus' teaching and say, he's a great moral teacher. He obviously is. He's a great moral teacher. The Sermon on the Mount's amazing. I really like his ethics. I just don't think he was the Son of God. I have spent time around people who claim to be God. I've done enough visits to mental hospitals that I've met a few of them. Their claims stand up to about 3 minutes conversation, generally. And in particular, if you claim to be God, you put a certain level of scrutiny on your life, which no lives stand up to. Then we have this other group of people whose teachings have influenced millions of people. And there's a few of them. There's a few humans whose teachings, whose morals, whose ethics have influenced millions or perhaps billions of people. As far as I know, there's one person that fits in both categories. Somebody who's claimed to be God, who used I am statements deliberately. Now, I went into my discussions in a tent quite confident in that. Turns out the philosophy and theology students of Edinburgh, who are prone to wander around and come into a tent at 3 a.m., have some pretty diverse thoughts on whether that trilemma is valid or not. So what else might you think? You might think, well, he doesn't really claim to be God. For sure, he uses some textual references and stuff. It's really clear if you read the whole of John, if you read the rest of the New Testament, that the people who were closest to Jesus when he was on earth believed that Jesus was God, that he claimed to be God, and they were convinced by it. Their encounters with him made them think God. Two, and this is where we've come from. If you read the Old Testament, you will know, you might say, people were more superstitious back then. They didn't really understand science. We know that these claims are ridiculous. There were no group of people, or it's what philosophers would call chronological snobbery, which is a phrase I really like, which is because we come after them, we're better than them. And that's, for sure, they didn't understand science in the way that you understand science. For sure, they had a different understanding of the cosmos and the universe than you do. But for first century Jews, there was no more blasphemous claim than to claim to be God. These were people who would not write or speak the name of God, who understand that the Holy of Holies is somewhere that you can go and be in the presence of God precisely one day a year for one person. And yet, these people who held Yahweh God in such high regard ended up believing that this man who walked among them, who they interacted with daily, and who talked to them was God. And more than that, history, proper history, things that happened, things that are provable, tells us that many of them staked absolutely everything on Jesus being God. In the years after these events, these people were fully dealt in 100%, all of their chips on Jesus being God. And I find that, this is hours and hours of chats if you want to come and have them. But yeah, so what are we left with? Where are we at? What are we doing? You may or may not be convinced about whether Jesus is God. But actually, what you might come to find is that it's what you need. You need a Savior that says, I am, and you need a Savior that weeps with you in your tragedies. That God entering the narrative, coming into the world, becoming flesh, is what has the capability of saving us. Jesus' friends in the Gospels constantly reference Jesus' love for them. Do you know and understand that same love in your life, that pursuit love, that chesed love? Encounters with Jesus in the Gospel, we've seen one here, always confront people with the reality of who he is. That's not just a good moral teacher. That's not just somebody who was thoughtful and kind and careful. It's somebody who claimed to be God and then showed it. Encounter is there for all of us. When you encounter when you encounter Jesus, when you read what he did, do you have an answer to the questions that Jesus sets us? And then finally, to stop the clock on Lazarus' funeral, Jesus needed to start the clock on his own. To pull Lazarus out of the grave, he needed to start the journey towards his own grave. And that was specifically true for Lazarus, but it's also a foreshadowing of what he does for everyone else on the planet. I am the resurrection and the life is delivered specifically into that circumstance, but actually that's a promise for all of us. That's a mirror for what he does for all of us on the cross. Jesus didn't come bellowing with rage. When Jesus is bellowing with rage, he's not angry at the people, he's not angry at God, but he is angry at the situation. He knows that he's set his course, and his course is to rescue all of us from the graves that we're in. So I don't know, maybe that's landed with some of you today in a way that's maybe not landed before. If you've heard something in there that you think is a hook for you, that you've cottoned onto, that you realize that actually you could encounter Jesus in this way, don't leave without having a chat with one of us. The prayer team are down the front. I'll be somewhere around. Maybe you know somebody who's brought you to church or who you know you can talk to. Mention that to them. Join the dots. Like, Jesus presents himself as God and then turns up and does things that look like God. I'd like you to be clear in your own mind as why. Cool. Right, I'm gonna pray and finish there.